Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is Gulliver's Travel by Jonathan Swift. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. Few books in the history of literature have blended adventure, satire, and political commentary as masterfully as Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. First published in 1726, this novel has intrigued and entertained readers for centuries. Its fantastical voyages disguising sharp critiques of human nature, government, and society. Though often mistaken for a children's book due to its whimsical settings and peculiar creatures, Gulliver's Travels is, at its core, a scathing satire, a mirror held up to the absurdities of 18th century politics, science, and human behavior. Jonathan Swift, an Irish writer and clergyman, was renowned for his biting wit and fearless criticism of those in power. At the time he wrote Gulliver's Travels, Britain was embroiled in political upheaval, with conflicts between the Whigs and Tories shaping the nation's future. Swift, disillusioned by corruption and hypocrisy, crafted this novel as an allegory, using fictional lands to expose the flaws of real-world institutions. His protagonist, Lemuel Gulliver, serves as both an observer and a tool of satire, his experiences in strange and exotic lands reflecting the contradictions of European society. The novel is divided into 4 distinct voyages, each presenting a bizarre world with its own peculiar rules. From the miniature kingdom of Lilliput, where petty politics mirror those of England, to the towering land of Brobdingnag, where Gulliver himself becomes the curiosity. Each journey forces the reader to reconsider the nature of power, morality, and human folly. The latter half of the book takes an even darker turn, exploring the deceptive nature of knowledge in the floating island of Laputa, and culminating in the unsettling society of the Houyhnhnms, where reason is worshipped and humanity itself is questioned. Gulliver's Travels remains relevant today, not only for its storytelling, but for its brutal honesty about the human condition. The book has been praised, censored, and even misinterpreted over the years, with some readers viewing Gulliver's transformation as a descent into madness, while others see it as enlightenment. Swift's satire spares no one. Kings, scientists, philosophers, and common men alike are all targets of his unrelenting critique. As we embark on this journey through Gulliver's Travels, we will follow Lemuel Gulliver across uncharted seas, witnessing the wonders and horrors of the lands he encounters. Each chapter will unravel the deeper meanings behind Swift's fantastical storytelling, immersing us in a world that is at once whimsical and profoundly unsettling. And so, our adventure begins. Lemuel Gulliver was an ordinary man with an extraordinary fate. Born into a respectable but modest family in Nottinghamshire, he had always possessed a thirst for knowledge and adventure. He studied medicine at the University of Leyden, but rather than confining himself to the life of a physician, he became a surgeon aboard ships, yearning to see the vast world beyond England's shores. His keen mind, sharp observation, and adaptability would serve him well, though he could never have imagined how drastically his journeys would change him. It was in the year 1699 that Gulliver embarked on what was to be a routine voyage aboard the Antelope, setting sail toward the East Indies. The sea was calm, and the days passed uneventfully until fate intervened. A A violent storm descended upon the ship, its howling winds and monstrous waves swallowing the vessel whole. The crew was tossed mercilessly into the abyss, and Gulliver, despite his frantic efforts, found himself dragged beneath the surface. In those harrowing moments, he was certain his life was over. Yet fortune, or perhaps some strange twist of fate, spared him. Struggling against exhaustion, he surfaced, barely managing to swim toward an unfamiliar shoreline. When at last his feet touched land, his body collapsed onto the damp earth, and sleep overtook him, his strength utterly drained. When Gulliver awoke, he found himself in a predicament beyond comprehension. He could not move. His arms, his legs, his very body were tightly bound to the ground by what felt like thin but unbreakable threads. Panic surged through him, but his struggle was futile. He blinked against the morning light, and to his astonishment, a tiny figure no more than 6 inches tall came into view, standing atop his chest. Dozens, no, hundreds, of these miniature people surrounded him. They were dressed in elaborate clothing, speaking in a strange, rapid tongue as they darted back and forth, carrying tiny weapons. Though their bows and arrows were laughably small, their sheer numbers made them a formidable force. Gulliver's mind reeled. Where was he? Who were these strange little men? It was then that a figure of apparent authority stepped forward, his richly adorned garments setting him apart from the rest. He spoke in a commanding tone, gesturing for silence as he addressed Gulliver. Though the words were unintelligible, the intention was clear. They saw him as a captive. Gulliver, understanding his precarious situation, decided not to resist further. Hours passed, and the tiny people, whom he would later learn were called the Lilliputians, worked tirelessly to transport him. They constructed a massive wooden platform pulled by hundreds of miniature horses, and with great effort they dragged him toward their capital city. Gulliver, still bound, marveled at their ingenuity. As they reached the grand city of Maldendo, Gulliver was finally able to take in his surroundings. Despite its miniature scale, the city was magnificent, with carefully constructed buildings, elaborate towers, and a bustling population. At the heart of the city stood an imposing palace, home to the Emperor of Lilliput himself. It was before this very palace that Gulliver was placed, still lying on the ground as the Emperor emerged, flanked by noblemen and guards. The Emperor, though diminutive, carried himself with the grandeur of a ruler many times his size. He studied Gulliver with a mixture of curiosity and caution, issuing commands to his subjects. Though Gulliver could not yet understand their language, he discerned that they intended to keep him under strict surveillance. He was given food, tiny loaves of bread, miniature cuts of meat, all of which he devoured in an instant. The sheer spectacle of his appetite astonished the Lilliputians, who scrambled to bring more provisions. Over the following days, Gulliver made a conscious effort to communicate. He carefully observed their language, picking up words and phrases. His patience and cooperation earned him a measure of trust. The Emperor himself seemed impressed by Gulliver's willingness to learn, and soon granted him limited freedom. As Gulliver's understanding of Lilliputian society grew, he learned that they were a people deeply entrenched in ceremony, tradition, and most notably, political rivalry. The kingdom was divided between 2 factions, the Tramxen and the Slanksen, or, as Gulliver soon discovered, the high heels and the low heels. Their dispute, the proper height of shoe heels, a matter so trivial yet so fiercely contested that it had caused deep divisions within the government. But the absurdity did not end there. The Lilliputians were also embroiled in a bitter conflict with the neighboring island nation of Blefuscu. The reason? A disagreement over the correct way to break an egg. Tradition dictated that eggs should be cracked on the larger end, yet a past emperor had decreed that they must be broken on the smaller end. This seemingly trivial decree had led to outright war, with countless lives lost in the name of egg-breaking orthodoxy. Gulliver listened to these tales with incredulity, yet he quickly realized the satire inherent in them. Though the Lilliputians saw their disputes as grand matters of state, their conflicts mirrored the absurdities of European politics, where wars were waged over petty disagreements, and power was determined by arbitrary customs. As his days in Lilliput continued, Gulliver's status transformed from that of a prisoner to an honored guest. He was given lodgings, albeit heavily guarded, and the people began to view him not as a threat, but as a potential ally. The emperor himself saw great potential in Gulliver, particularly in the looming war against Blefuscu. And so, Gulliver's fate was sealed. He would soon be drawn into the politics and conflicts of the tiny world around him, his colossal presence a force that could tip the scales of power. What had begun as an accidental voyage into the unknown was now the start of an adventure unlike any he had ever imagined. Gulliver quickly adapted to life in Lilliput, his immense size both a marvel and a challenge for the tiny inhabitants. Though they had initially feared him, his patience, mild temperament, and willingness to cooperate endeared him to the emperor and his court. He was granted accommodations, though his house was nothing more than a repurposed temple, the only structure large enough to shelter him. Every day, he continued his study of the Lilliputian language, gradually becoming fluent enough to converse with officials and courtiers. With his newfound understanding, he learned more about the intricacies of Lilliputian politics. The emperor, despite his initial hospitality, saw Gulliver not merely as a guest, but as a potential weapon. Lilliput's long-standing conflict with the neighboring island of Blefuscu had reached a stalemate, and the presence of a giant in their midst provided an unprecedented advantage. Though Gulliver had no personal stake in their war over egg-breaking customs, he realized that his survival in Lilliput depended on maintaining the emperor's favor. Thus, when he was summoned to a grand audience at the palace, he listened carefully as the emperor laid out his expectations. Blefuscu, he was told, had amassed a fleet of ships preparing for an attack on Lilliput's shores. If Gulliver were to serve the kingdom, he would be granted greater freedom and privileges. He agreed, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. The following morning, he waded into the channel that separated Lilliput from Blefuscu. The sea barely reached his waist as he approached the enemy fleet. The sight of the towering giant sent waves of panic through the Blefuscudian navy. Before they could react, Gulliver reached down and grasped the anchors of their warships, tying them together with thick cables he had fashioned from Lilliputian rope. The soldiers aboard fired their miniature arrows, but they were nothing more than pinpricks to him. With a final heave, he turned and dragged the entire fleet back to Lilliput, a feat that left both nations stunned. The emperor, overjoyed by Gulliver's success, declared a grand celebration. Lilliput had never known such a decisive victory. Yet, as the festivities carried on, Gulliver noticed a shift in the emperor's demeanor. His initial gratitude was overshadowed by ambition. Now that Blefuscu's fleet had been captured, he wished for Gulliver to complete the conquest, to return, destroy their city, and force its people into submission. This demand unsettled Gulliver. Though he had intervened in the conflict, he had done so under the assumption that it would lead to peace, not total domination. Destroying Blefuscu, he realized, would mean senseless suffering for a people whose only crime was following a different tradition. He hesitated, and in that moment, he understood how precarious his position in Lilliput truly was. As long as he was useful to the emperor, he was valued. But if he disobeyed, he could just as easily become a liability. Seeking a resolution, Gulliver requested permission to visit Blefuscu as an envoy rather than an invader. The emperor reluctantly agreed, though his displeasure was evident. Upon arriving in Blefuscu, he was received with a mixture of awe and caution. The rulers of the island, though wary of his past actions, saw in him a potential ally rather than an enemy. They offered him refuge, subtly implying that should his fortunes in Lilliput change, he would be welcome among them. His time in Blefuscu proved to be fateful. While exploring the island's shores, Gulliver spotted an object in the distance, something that did not belong in this miniature world. As he approached, his heart leaped. It was a real boat, though damaged and weather-worn. The realization struck him. This was his chance to return home. Determined, he sought materials to repair the vessel. The Blefuscudians, eager to see him leave before he drew Lilliput's wrath upon them, provided him with supplies. Over the next few weeks, he worked tirelessly, fashioning a sail, reinforcing the hull, and preparing provisions. Just as he was ready to set sail, a message arrived from Lilliput. The emperor had grown suspicious of Gulliver's loyalties. His refusal to destroy Blefuscu had been interpreted as defiance, and worse still, rumors had spread that he was conspiring against the throne. A secret council had convened, and the decision had been made. Gulliver was to be blinded. The plan was cruel but calculated. Without his sight, Gulliver would still be of use to Lilliput. He could serve as an imposing figure, capable of instilling fear, yet rendered harmless. When Gulliver received word of this scheme, his mind was made up. He could not remain in Lilliput any longer. Under the cover of night, he set sail, leaving behind the tiny world that had once seemed so vast. The sea stretched endlessly before him, and for days he drifted, his fate uncertain. Then, by sheer chance, he was spotted by a passing ship. The crew, astonished by his ragged state, took him aboard. As he recounted his tale, they listened with amusement and skepticism. A land of tiny people, a war over eggs. It seemed too absurd to be true, but Gulliver knew what he had seen. Though he was relieved to be returning to England, he could not shake the realization that his perspective on the world had been forever altered. He arrived home to the embrace of his wife and family, yet even as he settled back into familiar surroundings, he felt a lingering sense of restlessness. The world he had left behind still called to him, and deep within, he knew that his adventures were far from over. Although Gulliver had returned to England, his heart was still restless. The comforts of home, the familiarity of his wife and children, and the routine of his old life should have brought him peace. But instead, they left him yearning for the adventure he had left behind. He had seen a world so different, so fantastical, that the ordinary now felt stifling. His stories were met with amusement or outright disbelief. Some dismissed them as mere sailors' tales, while others humored him with polite nods and indulgent smiles, as though entertaining the fantasies of a man who had spent too long at sea. But Gulliver knew what he had seen. He had lived among the Lilliputians, witnessed their absurd political rivalries, and nearly lost his life in their world. And yet, here in England, it all seemed unreal, almost as though it had been a dream. For a time, he attempted to reintegrate into society. He resumed his medical practice, attending to patients with the same precision and care as before, but his mind often drifted elsewhere. The cases that had once fascinated him now felt trivial in comparison to the grand experiences he had endured. He tried to find solace in family life, but even that proved difficult. Though his wife had been overjoyed at his return, she sensed his detachment. He was physically present, but emotionally distant, his thoughts always seeming to linger on something beyond the horizon. It was no surprise, then, that when an opportunity arose to sail once more, he seized it without hesitation. One evening, while visiting the docks, he encountered an old acquaintance, a captain by the name of John Nicholas, who commanded a merchant vessel called the Adventure. Nicholas, aware of Gulliver's past voyages, mentioned that he was in need of a skilled surgeon for an expedition to the East Indies. The journey promised wealth, excitement, and a chance to see lands unknown. Without a second thought, Gulliver accepted the offer. His wife pleaded with him to stay, but she knew deep down that nothing could change his mind. He was a man drawn to the unknown, a traveler by nature, and England, with all its comforts, could never hold him for long. The voyage began smoothly. The Adventure was a sturdy vessel, manned by an experienced crew, and the weather was favorable for many weeks. The sea, vast and unyielding, stretched endlessly in every direction, and Gulliver felt a sense of peace he had not known since leaving Lilliput. He spent his days tending to the health of the sailors, studying the stars, and charting their progress on maps. Yet, as had happened on his previous journey, fate was not content to let him return home unscathed. One fateful night, as the ship sailed through unfamiliar waters, a violent storm descended upon them. The sky darkened, and the wind howled like a vengeful spirit. Towering waves crashed against the ship, tossing it like a mere toy. The crew fought desperately to maintain control, but nature was merciless. The sails were torn, the mast cracked under the relentless force of the wind, and the Adventure was driven far off course. For days, they drifted aimlessly, their food and water supplies dwindling. Morale sank as the realization set in they were lost. Then, just as despair threatened to consume them, a cry rang out from the lookout, "Land, land ahead." Relief swept through the crew as they beheld a distant shoreline, a promise of salvation after weeks of hardship. Though they knew not what lay ahead, they had no choice but to venture toward the unknown land. With great effort, they guided the battered ship toward the shore, dropping anchor in a small bay surrounded by dense forests. Gulliver, eager to explore, volunteered to go ashore with a small party. The men rowed toward the beach, their oars slicing through the calm waters. As they stepped onto solid ground, a sense of unease settled over them. The island was eerily quiet, no sign of human habitation, no birds singing in the trees, only the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Cautiously, they ventured inland. The vegetation was unlike anything they had ever seen: trees with enormous, twisted trunks, flowers that bloomed in unnatural colors, and grass that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. Everything felt slightly off, as though they had stepped into another world. Then, without warning, the earth trembled beneath them. A deafening sound filled the air, a rhythmic pounding that grew louder with each passing second. The men froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. From the shadows of the towering trees emerged a colossal figure. No, not just one, but several. Giants. Gulliver could scarcely believe his eyes. These beings stood nearly 60 feet tall, their strides covering vast distances with ease. Their clothing, though simple, was finely woven, and their faces bore expressions of curiosity rather than hostility. The sailors, overwhelmed with terror, turned and fled, sprinting back toward the boat. But Gulliver, in his astonishment, remained rooted to the spot. He had been a giant in Lilliput, a towering figure among the tiny inhabitants. Now the roles were reversed. He was the small one, the insignificant one. Before he could react, a giant hand reached down and scooped him up with surprising gentleness. He struggled, but it was futile. The creature, evidently a farmer, examined him with fascination, his immense eyes scanning Gulliver's tiny form. Gulliver shouted, attempting to communicate, but the giant merely tilted his head, as though trying to decipher the strange sounds. With great care, the farmer carried Gulliver back to his home, a house that dwarfed any structure Gulliver had ever seen. There, he was introduced to the farmer's family, who gathered around, whispering in hushed voices. Though he could not understand their language, their gestures and expressions suggested curiosity rather than malice. The farmer's daughter, a young girl with a kind face, took a particular interest in him. She cradled him as one might a small pet, speaking to him in a soft, melodic tone. In the days that followed, Gulliver found himself treated as a novelty, a tiny marvel in a land of giants. He was given food, massive portions that he could barely consume, and a small bed crafted from scraps of fabric. Though he was not mistreated, he was not entirely free either. The farmer, realizing Gulliver's uniqueness, saw an opportunity. He began exhibiting Gulliver in public, parading him before crowds in exchange for money. At first, Gulliver played along, knowing that resistance was futile. He performed tricks, recited phrases in his own language, and allowed himself to be handled by curious onlookers. Yet, as the days passed, he grew weary of being a spectacle. He longed for freedom, for a way to escape this land of giants. But how could he, when every step he took was dwarfed by the world around him? The answer, he realized, would come not through resistance, but through patience. He would learn their language, understand their customs, and wait for the right moment. For now, he was but a tiny figure in a land of giants, but he would not remain so forever. Part 4, Gulliver soon resigned himself to his new life as a curiosity among giants. The farmer, whom he had come to recognize as his master, wasted no time in capitalizing on his unique presence. He took Gulliver from town to town, displaying him to crowds of astonished Brobdingnagians, who paid handsomely for the chance to see the tiny man perform. To them, he was no more than an entertaining oddity, something to marvel at and discuss over their meals. At first, Gulliver endured these exhibitions with patience. He understood that his survival depended on his master's goodwill, and so he performed tricks, conversed in his own language to amuse the crowds, and demonstrated how he ate and drank from thimble-sized vessels. His master treated him well enough, though with the detached care of a man preserving an asset rather than caring for a fellow being. But as the days turned into weeks, the constant handling and scrutiny became unbearable. He was prodded and examined like an insect, forced to endure the overwhelming noise and odor of the enormous spectators. His limbs ached from the strain of constant travel, and his spirit began to wane. The only solace he found was in the farmer's daughter, Glumdalclitch. Unlike the others, she did not see him merely as an object of amusement. To her, he He was something delicate and precious, a creature to be protected rather than exploited. She cared for him tenderly, sewing him tiny garments from scraps of fine cloth, bathing him gently in a small wooden trough, and ensuring he was well fed. Her affection was genuine, and though Gulliver resented his captivity, he could not help but be grateful for her kindness. However, as time passed, it became clear that the farmer had more ambition than sense. Seeing the immense popularity of his tiny charge, he pushed Gulliver to the limits, making him perform constantly, sometimes in harsh conditions. The strain began to take its toll, and soon Gulliver's health started to deteriorate. His small body was not built for such rigorous displays, and the constant travel weakened him. His appetite dwindled, his energy faded, and he fell ill. Glumdalclitch, deeply concerned, pleaded with her father to let him rest, but the farmer was too blinded by greed to listen. Realizing that Gulliver's condition was worsening, the farmer made a decision, one that would benefit him financially, while relieving him of the responsibility of his tiny possession. He resolved to sell Gulliver to the royal court. A messenger had informed him that the Queen of Brobdingnag had heard of the miniature man and expressed an interest in seeing him. This was an opportunity too great to pass up, and so the farmer arranged for Gulliver to be presented to Her Majesty. On the appointed day, Gulliver was taken to the grand palace of Brobdingnag, a structure so immense that its walls seemed to stretch to the heavens. Everything about the royal court was extravagant. The towering marble pillars, the glittering chandeliers the size of entire ships, the richly woven tapestries that adorned the halls. As he was carried into the presence of the Queen, Gulliver felt more like an ornament than a living being, a plaything to be examined and admired. The Queen, upon seeing him, was utterly delighted. She had never encountered anything so extraordinary in her life. Though Brobdingnag was home to many wonders, a tiny man no bigger than a doll was beyond imagination. She asked him questions, marveling at his intelligence and refinement. Unlike the crude farmers and townspeople who had gawked at him before, the Queen seemed genuinely fascinated by his existence, treating him with a level of dignity he had not experienced in a long time. Seeing that Her Majesty was taken with the tiny man, the farmer wasted no time in negotiating his sale. The Queen, who had more wealth than she could ever need, agreed without hesitation. Thus, Gulliver was officially transferred into the care of the royal court, his days of public exhibition coming to an end. Glumdalclitch, fearing for his well-being, begged the Queen to allow her to stay and care for him. The Queen, recognizing the bond between the girl and the tiny man, granted her request. Gulliver's life changed drastically after that. He was no longer paraded around as a spectacle for commoners. Instead, he became the Queen's personal entertainer, a cherished oddity within the court. He dined at her table, seated upon a special platform that elevated him to her level. He conversed with the king and his advisors, answering their questions about his homeland and recounting his adventures with eloquence. The Queen often invited noble guests to witness his wit and intelligence, and though he was still something of a curiosity, he was at least treated with a semblance of respect. Yet, despite the improved conditions, Gulliver could not shake the feeling of being trapped. He had exchanged one form of captivity for another. The Queen's kindness did not change the fact that he was still a prisoner, a possession to be admired and doted upon. The vastness of Brobdingnag, its immense landscapes and towering inhabitants, only reinforced his own insignificance. He He was utterly dependent on others, unable to venture outside without being carried, unable to fend for himself in a world where everything was a potential threat. One of the greatest dangers he faced was the sheer scale of the creatures around him. In Brobdingnag, even the smallest animals were enormous in comparison to him. On more than one occasion, he had been tormented by the palace's pet animals, dogs that nearly crushed him with their playful paws, birds that swooped down as if to snatch him away. The most terrifying incident occurred when he was nearly swallowed whole by a palace monkey, which mistook him for a piece of food. It had seized him in its hairy hands, stuffing him into its mouth before being subdued by the frantic efforts of the palace staff. Gulliver, shaken to his core, realized that he was constantly at risk in a world where he was no more significant than an insect. The king of Brobdingnag, though intrigued by Gulliver, often questioned the values and customs of his homeland. In their conversations, the king listened with skepticism as Gulliver described England's politics, wars, and social structures. To the Brobdingnagian ruler, much of what Gulliver considered to be the height of civilization appeared foolish, corrupt, or needlessly violent. The king found the idea of war particularly absurd, expressing disbelief that such tiny creatures would engage in such destructive conflicts. He laughed at the notion of lawyers twisting language to deceive rather than to seek justice. He found the greed of European rulers, their obsession with conquest and expansion, to be utterly irrational. Gulliver, despite his pride in his homeland, found himself unable to refute many of the king's criticisms. The more he tried to explain, the more he saw the flaws in his own society. Compared to the simple, just, and peaceful way of life in Brobdingnag, the complexities of English governance seemed riddled with corruption. The realization unsettled him. Though life in the palace was safer than his previous existence with the farmer, it was still a form of confinement. He longed for freedom, for a return to the world where he belonged. But how could he escape? He was too small to survive on his own, and there seemed to be no way to leave the kingdom. He began to wonder if he would spend the rest of his days as the Queen's miniature companion, forever trapped in a world too large for him. But fate, as always, had other plans. His journey in Brobdingnag was far from over, and before long, circumstances would arise that would change everything once again. Gulliver's life in the royal court of Brobdingnag had settled into a strange routine. He was no longer paraded around for commoners' amusement, but had instead become a prized possession of the Queen. He dined at her table, entertained her with stories of his homeland, and was frequently the subject of intense discussions between the king and his advisors. Glumdalclitch remained by his side, acting as both his nurse and protector, ensuring that he was kept safe from the various dangers that surrounded him in this land of giants. Despite the relative comfort of his new life, Gulliver could not shake a deep sense of confinement. He had exchanged one form of captivity for another. Though he was no longer mistreated, he was still a curiosity, an oddity meant to amuse the court rather than a free man. He was constantly under watch, unable to move independently, and reliant on the Queen and Glumdalclitch for his most basic needs. His thoughts often drifted back to England, and he longed for the freedom of his former life. As time passed, Gulliver grew accustomed to the customs of Brobdingnag, but he could never fully adjust to his precarious existence among creatures so vastly larger than himself. Everyday objects posed constant threats: giant plates of food, rivers of spilled drinks. Even a simple gust of wind from an open window could send him toppling over. But the greatest danger came not from objects, but from the living creatures that roamed the palace. The Queen's palace was home to various animals, many of which saw Gulliver as little more than a plaything, or worse, a meal. The Queen's pet dwarf, who had once enjoyed being the smallest creature in court, resented Gulliver's presence and took every opportunity to torment him. The dwarf would seize him unexpectedly, shaking him violently or throwing him into unexpected situations, all under the guise of jest. The Queen found the dwarf's antics amusing at first, but Glumdalclitch, ever protective, complained bitterly about the cruel treatment. Eventually, the Queen ordered the dwarf to cease his mischief, but the resentment lingered. More dangerous than the dwarf were the household pets. A monkey once seized Gulliver, mistaking him for a plaything, and carried him to the rooftop of the palace. He screamed for help as the massive creature tossed him from hand to hand, examining him with curious eyes. It took the efforts of several servants to retrieve him before he was injured, or worse. He was badly shaken by the ordeal, and Glumdalclitch refused to leave him alone for even a moment after that. Another terrifying incident occurred when he found himself face to face with a palace rat. The creature was enormous in comparison to him, the size of a large dog, with gleaming eyes and sharp, yellowed teeth. The rat, likely hungry, lunged at him without hesitation. In a desperate attempt to defend himself, Gulliver drew his tiny sword, one of the few possessions he had managed to retain since his arrival, and stabbed at the rat's exposed belly. The creature shrieked in pain, but did not immediately retreat. It took several more frantic strikes before the rat collapsed, twitching and bleeding. Though victorious, Gulliver was left shaken, covered in the foul-smelling blood of the beast. The Queen and her court were greatly impressed by his bravery, but the experience only reinforced his fears. He was constantly at risk in this world, where he was no more than an insect. Beyond physical dangers, Gulliver found himself constantly challenged by the intellectual and moral discussions he had with the King of Brobdingnag. Unlike the Queen, who adored him as a mere curiosity, the king was keenly interested in Gulliver's descriptions of European society, particularly England. He questioned him thoroughly about his homeland's government, military, and cultural practices, and Gulliver, eager to defend the virtues of his people, spoke proudly of England's parliamentary system, its advancements in science, and its naval prowess. However, the king was unimpressed. From his perspective, the way Gulliver described European politics revealed a society filled with corruption, greed, and unnecessary warfare. He was horrified to learn about the frequent wars fought by England and its neighboring countries, especially over disputes that seemed trivial to him. To the king, war was an abomination, a practice that only the most foolish of rulers would engage in. He could not comprehend why small kingdoms, filled with people so similar to one another, would constantly fight over power, trade, and land. Gulliver attempted to explain the complexities of European diplomacy, but the king was disgusted. He remarked that it seemed as though European rulers had no true concern for the well-being of their people, but instead sought only to expand their own power and wealth at any cost. When Gulliver boasted about England's technological advancements in weaponry and military strategy, the king was even more appalled. He expressed his belief that any civilization that placed so much value on destruction could not truly be called civilized. This conversation deeply unsettled Gulliver. Though he had always been proud of his homeland, he could not deny that the king's observations held some truth. The simple, peaceful life of the Brobdingnagians contrasted starkly with the conflicts and struggles of Europe. Unlike the European rulers, who constantly sought to outmaneuver and dominate one another, the king of Brobdingnag ruled with a sense of justice and fairness. There were no lawyers in Brobdingnag because the laws were written so plainly that they required no interpretation. There was no standing army because the people had no enemies, and their sheer size made them difficult to threaten. The king's views made Gulliver question many of the ideals he had previously held as self-evident. Yet, despite these profound conversations, Gulliver's longing for home never waned. Though Brobdingnag was peaceful, and its people, for the most part, treated him well, he felt like an outsider. The vastness of the world around him, the sheer impossibility of navigating it on his own, made him feel like a prisoner rather than a guest. He began to despair that he might never leave Brobdingnag, that he would spend the rest of his life as the queen's possession, forever at the mercy of creatures hundreds of times his size. His escape, however, would come in the most unexpected way. One day, the queen arranged for Gulliver and Glumdalclitch to accompany her on a journey to the seaside. Though Gulliver had seen the ocean before, he had never been this close to it in Brobdingnag. The sight of the endless horizon, the vast stretch of water meeting the sky, filled him with a longing he had not felt in a long time. As they settled into their coastal accommodations, Gulliver found himself with more freedom than he had in the palace. Glumdalclitch, exhausted from the journey, was resting in their quarters, leaving Gulliver to entertain himself near the shore. The queen had provided him with a small traveling box, a specially crafted wooden chamber that served as his portable home. It was sturdy, well-built, and equipped with small windows and a door. Gulliver often spent time inside it when he needed solitude. On this particular day, fate intervened in a way he could never have anticipated. A sudden gust of wind, stronger than usual, lifted the box from its resting place and sent it tumbling into the ocean. Gulliver barely had time to react before he was plunged into darkness, the box rocking violently as the waves carried it away from the shore. Panic gripped him as he realized what had happened. He was adrift at sea, alone and completely at the mercy of the elements. Though he had longed to leave Brobdingnag, this was not how he had envisioned his escape. Trapped inside the box, he could do nothing but pray that fate would carry him to safety. He did not know where he was going, nor if he would ever see another human being again. All he knew was that his time in Brobdingnag had come to an abrupt and perilous end. Gulliver's heart pounded in his chest as the wooden box rocked violently upon the ocean waves. He had no control over his fate, no way to steer, no way to escape. The box had been built to keep him safe on land, not to withstand the full force of the sea. As it drifted farther from the shore of Brobdingnag, he clung to the walls, desperately hoping that the structure would hold. Water seeped in through the cracks, soaking his clothes and pooling around his feet. He tried to peer through the tiny windows, but the view outside was disorienting. Rolling waves rose and fell, the sky above shifting unpredictably. He had no idea where he was going, Had he been carried out to the vast open ocean? Was he heading toward an unknown land, or would he be swallowed by the sea? Hours passed, or perhaps even days. Trapped in darkness, he had no way to measure time. Hunger gnawed at him, but the fear of his situation overpowered any desire for food. He could hear the crashing of waves against the wooden walls, the creaking of the box under the strain of the current. Would it hold together long enough for him to be rescued? Then, suddenly, there was a shift. The rocking of the box slowed, and he felt it rise slightly, as though something was lifting it. A moment later, the entire structure lurched upward, tilting sharply to one side. Gulliver was thrown against the wall, barely managing to catch himself before he tumbled onto the wet floor. His mind raced. Was he being lifted by the waves, or had something far more terrifying seized him? A loud scraping sound filled the air, followed by a sudden jolt as the box seemed to rise higher and higher. Then, just as quickly, it stopped moving altogether. For a moment, everything was still. The familiar sensation of floating on the water had disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, there was a loud thud. The top of the box was wrenched open, and dazzling sunlight flooded in. Gulliver blinked, momentarily blinded, as he tried to adjust his eyes to the sudden brightness. He squinted upward, his breath catching in his throat. Above him, staring down with a look of utter disbelief, was a human face, a face of normal proportions, one that did not belong to a giant. His heart leapt. He had been rescued by people of his own kind. Strong hands reached into the box and pulled him out. Gulliver found himself hoisted into the air and placed onto the deck of a ship. His legs wobbled as he tried to steady himself, still disoriented from his time adrift. A group of sailors stood around him, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and curiosity. One man stepped forward, clearly the captain, judging by the authority in his stance and the respect the others showed him. He was a middle-aged man with weathered skin, a thick beard and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough yet not unkind. Gulliver took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. "I am Lemuel Gulliver," he said hoarsely, "an Englishman. I was shipwrecked and found myself in a land unlike any other, a place where men are as tall as church steeples." The sailors exchanged skeptical glances. The captain raised an eyebrow. "A land of giants, you say?" Gulliver nodded earnestly. "Yes, Brobdingnag, it was called. I was kept as a curiosity, a plaything for their court. I only escaped by accident when the wind carried my wooden dwelling out to sea." The men murmured among themselves. It was clear that they found his story hard to believe. And why wouldn't they? If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he too would have dismissed such a tale as mere fantasy. The captain crossed his arms, studying him carefully. "You say you were a prisoner among giants, yet here you stand, no worse for wear. You do not seem starved or mistreated." Gulliver hesitated. "I was treated well, in a manner of speaking. The Queen of Brobdingnag took a liking to me, and I was given care, food, and shelter. But I was never free. I was a pet, a plaything. I longed for my liberty." The captain's expression softened slightly, as though he recognized something truthful in Gulliver's words. "Well, whatever your tale may be, you are fortunate that we found you," he said at last. "This is an English vessel bound for home. You are welcome aboard." Relief flooded Gulliver's body. England. After all he had been through, he was finally going home. He could hardly believe it. He looked around at the ship, the familiar sight of sails billowing in the wind, the rhythmic creaking of the wooden deck beneath his feet. It had been so long since he had seen anything of normal proportions. Just the sight of ordinary men and ordinary objects was enough to make his head spin. Over the next few days, Gulliver recovered from his ordeal. The sailors provided him with food, water, and clean clothes, and though they remained skeptical of his tales, they treated him with kindness. He spent much of his time staring out at the horizon, barely able to grasp the reality of his escape. Yet, despite his joy at returning to England, he could not shake a strange feeling of detachment. He had spent so much time among the giants of Brobdingnag that everything now seemed small. The very men who had rescued him, whom he had once thought of as ordinary, now appeared almost miniature in comparison to the colossal figures he had lived among. At mealtimes, he found himself uneasy. The plates of food before him were so tiny, what had once seemed like a normal portion now looked absurdly small. The utensils felt delicate in his hands, as though they might break with the slightest pressure. When he drank from a cup, he found himself hesitating, expecting a great flood of liquid like the giant goblets he had grown accustomed to in Brobdingnag. More than once, he caught himself looking up instinctively, as though expecting some towering figure to loom over him. But there were no giants here, only ordinary men. The realization unsettled him. He had longed for this moment, dreamed of returning to a world where he was not a toy, not a pet, not an anomaly. Yet, now that he was here, he felt strangely out of place. His mind had been shaped by Brobdingnag, and he was no longer sure if he truly belonged in England anymore. The captain noticed his unease. One evening, as they stood together on deck, he said, "You have the look of a man who has been gone from home too long." Gulliver sighed. "Perhaps I have," the captain nodded. "The sea changes men. Some find it easy to return to what they knew, others not so much." Gulliver looked out at the endless stretch of ocean. He had escaped Brobdingnag. He was going home. But the question remained, would home still feel like home? Or had he been changed forever by his time in the land of giants? Only time would tell. After weeks at sea, the ship finally reached England's shores. As Gulliver stepped onto solid ground for the first time since his voyage had begun, a strange mixture of relief and unease settled over him. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, returning home, reuniting with his wife and children, walking once more through the familiar streets of London. Yet, as he looked around at the people bustling through the port, a deep sense of alienation clung to him. Everything seemed smaller. The buildings, the ships, the carriages, all of it appeared reduced in scale, as though he were looking at a miniature model of the world he had once known. He knew, logically, that nothing had changed. It was he who had changed, shaped by his time in Brobdingnag, where men towered over him like living mountains. Brushing aside his unease, he made his way home. The streets were just as he had left them, the familiar sights and sounds of London filling the air, the cries of merchants selling their wares, the clatter of horses' hooves against the cobblestones, the distant hum of voices. Yet, despite its familiarity, he felt strangely detached, as though he were merely a visitor in his own land. At last, he arrived at his home. His wife, Mary, had long since given up hope of his return. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Lemuel," she whispered, as if she could not trust her own eyes. Gulliver stepped forward, smiling despite himself. "It's me, Mary," "I've come home." Tears welled in her eyes as she rushed to embrace him, but as she wrapped her arms around him, he stiffened. It was not that he did not love her. He had longed for this reunion, but something inside him had shifted. The touch of another human, someone of his own size, felt strangely unnatural to him. He had grown accustomed to the enormous hands of Brobdingnag, the gentle yet immense grasp of the queen, the playful yet terrifying handling of the giant child Glumdalclitch. Mary's touch, though once familiar, now felt unsettlingly small. His children peered out from behind their mother, their faces a mix of wonder and hesitation. They had been so young when he had left. Would they even remember him? He knelt before them, trying to smile. "Come now, do you not recognize your father?" The children hesitated before stepping forward, but their movements were cautious, uncertain. Gulliver could see the doubt in their eyes. He had been gone for so long, perhaps in their minds, he was more of a story than a real person. As the days passed, Gulliver tried to settle back into his old life. He walked through the city, reconnected with old acquaintances, and attempted to resume his medical practice. Yet, no matter where he went, he felt a growing sense of dissatisfaction. At meals, he found himself staring at the food before him, unconsciously comparing it to the enormous portions he had once been served in Brobdingnag. A loaf of bread in England was nothing compared to the towering slabs he had once eaten. The cups were too small, the chairs too delicate. Even the very streets seemed narrower than he remembered. More troubling still was his growing impatience with the people around him. Their conversations, once engaging, now seemed shallow and petty. He found himself annoyed by their complaints, their ambitions, their daily concerns. Had he not seen a world so much greater than this? Had he not walked among giants, witnessed their wisdom and power? One evening, as he sat with Mary by the fire, she placed a hand on his arm. "Lemuel," she said gently, "you have not been yourself since you returned." He looked at her, startled. "What do you mean? You seem distant, lost in thought. You hardly speak of your journey, yet I can see it weighs upon you. What happened to you out there?" Gulliver hesitated. How could he explain? How could he put into words the feeling of being so small in a world of giants, the way his very perception of existence had been altered? If he told her of Brobdingnag, of the Queen and Glumdalclitch, would she even believe him? "I saw things that I cannot unsee," he said at last. "I lived among people who were not like us, people greater in every way. And now that I am back, I feel as though I do not belong here anymore." Mary's expression was one of concern. "But you do belong here. This is your home, Lemuel. We are your family." He looked away, his hands tightening into fists. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to slip back into his old life, to forget Brobdingnag and all he had seen. But could he? As the weeks passed, his discontent grew. He found himself avoiding people, preferring solitude. He spent long hours in his study, writing feverishly, pouring his thoughts onto paper in an attempt to make sense of his experiences. Yet, no matter how much he wrote, he could not rid himself of the feeling that he was now a stranger in his own world. One day, as he wandered near the docks, his gaze was drawn to the ships moored in the harbor. He watched as sailors moved about, preparing for their next voyages. The sight stirred something deep within him. The sea had taken him to unimaginable places, shown him things no other man had seen. Did he truly wish to remain here, confined to a life that no longer felt like his own? A thought began to form in his mind, an idea that both thrilled and terrified him. Perhaps he was not meant to stay in England. Perhaps his journey was not yet over. That night, as he lay in bed beside Mary, staring at the ceiling, he made his decision. He would set sail once more. He would venture out into the unknown, seeking lands beyond imagination. He would find a place where he felt he belonged. The call of adventure was too strong to resist. And so, without telling his wife, without saying a word to anyone, he began to make preparations for his next voyage. What wonders and what horrors awaited him beyond the horizon? Only time would tell. Gulliver could not ignore the call of the sea. Though he had returned to England, though he had his family and his home, something deep within him yearned for more. The world beyond England's shores had changed him. He had seen things no other man had seen, tiny Lilliputians who waged petty wars, towering Brobdingnagians who saw humanity's flaws with unnerving clarity. How could he now confine himself to the ordinary life of a surgeon in London? Unable to resist the pull of adventure, Gulliver secretly prepared for another voyage. He secured a position as a ship's surgeon aboard the Hopewell, a merchant vessel bound for the East Indies. He did not tell Mary until the night before he left. She stared at him in disbelief, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "You are leaving us again," she whispered. Gulliver turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "I cannot stay," he said simply. "There is more out there, Mary. I have seen too much to remain here. The sea calls to me." Tears welled in her eyes. "And what of your children? What of me?" His heart ached, but he could not explain the restlessness that had taken hold of him. No words could convey the longing that burned within him, the need to see more, to understand more. "I will return," he promised. "But I must go." She said nothing, only turned away from him, retreating into the shadows of their home. It was the last time he would see her for many years. The next morning, he boarded the Hopewell, and once again, the waves carried him away from everything he had known. A strange and terrifying land at first, the voyage was uneventful. The Hopewell sailed smoothly across the vast ocean, its crew busy with the demands of life at sea. Gulliver settled into his role, treating minor ailments among the sailors, keeping to himself when he could. He spent long hours staring at the horizon, wondering what awaited him this time. Then, disaster struck. A violent storm descended upon the ship, turning the sea into a churning, merciless force. The winds howled like demons. The waves rose like mountains, crashing down upon the Hopewell with a fury that threatened to tear it apart. The crew fought desperately to keep the vessel afloat, but it was no use. The ship was doomed. Gulliver was thrown overboard, swallowed by the raging sea. The water closed over his head, dragging him down into darkness. He fought against the currents, his lungs burning as he struggled to stay afloat. Just when he thought he could hold on no longer, a great wave lifted him and hurled him forward. He caught a glimpse of land, jagged rocks, and a dark, unfamiliar coastline. With the last of his strength, he swam toward it. Gasping for breath, he crawled onto the shore, collapsing onto the wet sand. He lay there for hours, his body aching, his mind spinning. When he finally opened his eyes, he realized he was not alone. Towering above him were figures unlike any he had ever seen. They were not giants, nor were they tiny like the Lilliputians. These creatures were different, tall and lean, with long, sinewy limbs and faces that were eerily human yet entirely alien. Their eyes gleamed with intelligence, yet their expressions were unreadable. Gulliver tried to rise, but his body was too weak. He could only watch as the strange beings surrounded him, murmuring in a language he could not understand. One of them reached out, touching his arm with a curious, almost cautious gesture. Then, without warning, they lifted him up and carried him away. The land of the Houyhnhnms and the Yahoo's Gulliver was taken to a settlement unlike any he had ever seen. There were no grand cities, no towering castles or intricate villages. Instead, the land was peaceful, untouched by war or greed. The creatures moved with an air of dignity and grace, their society seemingly governed by an unspoken order. As Gulliver regained his strength, he slowly began to understand where he was. These beings were called Houyhnhnms, intelligent, rational creatures who resembled horses, yet possessed a wisdom far beyond that of any human civilization he had ever known. They lived in harmony, free from corruption, deceit, or conflict. Their language was precise, devoid of lies or exaggeration. They valued reason above all else, and their society functioned with a quiet, effortless efficiency. There were no rulers, no wars, no crime. Every Houyhnhnm understood his role, and they lived in a state of pure, untainted rationality. Gulliver was in awe. Never had he encountered a civilization so perfect. The Lilliputians had been petty and warlike, the Brobdingnagians wise yet condescending. But the Houyhnhnms, they were different. They were pure. They had achieved something that mankind never could. Yet, for all their wisdom, the Houyhnhnms did not live alone. There was another race in their land, one that filled Gulliver with horror. The Yahoos. Gulliver had thought himself prepared for the wonders and terrors of the world, but nothing could have prepared him for the sight of the Yahoos. They were creatures that resembled humans, yet they were nothing more than beasts. They lived in filth, their bodies covered in matted hair, their eyes filled with mindless hunger. They fought amongst themselves, hoarded useless treasures, and wallowed in their own waste. The Houyhnhnms regarded them with a mixture of pity and disgust, seeing them as little more than animals, violent, irrational, and incapable of reason. And then came the most disturbing realization of all. The Yahoos looked exactly like Gulliver. A shocking revelation for the first time in all his travels, Gulliver felt a deep, unsettling shame. He had prided himself on being a rational, intelligent man, a representative of human civilization. But as he looked at the Yahoos, he could not deny the resemblance. He saw in them the worst traits of mankind: greed, cruelty, ignorance. The Houyhnhnms, in contrast, were everything he wished humanity could be. He longed to be accepted by them, to shed his identity as a man, and live among these noble creatures as one of their own. He studied their language, learned their customs, did everything he could to prove that he was not like the Yahoos. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, the Houyhnhnms could not ignore what he was. To them, he was an anomaly, an intelligent Yahoo, yes, but a Yahoo nonetheless. And in their society, there was no place for creatures like him. Gulliver did not want to accept it, but the truth was undeniable. He was not one of them. He never could be. For the first time in his life, he hated what he was. As the days passed, Gulliver became more desperate to prove himself. He argued for his own rationality, for his right to remain among the Houyhnhnms. But their decision had already been made. He did not belong. One evening, as the sun set over the tranquil land, the leader of the Houyhnhnms spoke to him gently but firmly. It was time for him to leave. Gulliver's heart broke. He had found the most perfect society in the world, and now he was being cast out, not because of anything he had done, but because of what he was: a Yahoo. As he prepared to leave, his mind swirled with turmoil. He had journeyed across the world, seen lands beyond imagination. But now, he faced the most painful question of all. If he no longer belonged with humanity, and he could not stay with the Houyhnhnms, where did he belong? And with that thought, Gulliver set out once more, his heart heavy with a realization he could never escape. Gulliver was devastated. The Houyhnhnms, the beings he had come to revere as the epitome of wisdom and virtue, had cast him out. He had tried so hard to shed the identity of a Yahoo, to distance himself from the base, irrational nature of mankind. Yet he could not escape what he was. No matter how much he admired the Houyhnhnms, he would never be one of them. With a heavy heart, he left their land, knowing he would never return. The thought filled him with sorrow greater than any he had felt before. To leave behind the perfect world he had glimpsed was almost unbearable. Yet he had no choice. He had overstayed his welcome, and the Houyhnhnms, always rational, had decided that his presence among them was unnatural. His journey back to the human world was not an easy one. The Houyhnhnms, though unwilling to keep him, had shown him some kindness by providing him with materials to build a small boat. With their help, he constructed a simple but sturdy vessel, stocked it with provisions, and with a final look at the land of the Houyhnhnms, set out to sea once more. For days he drifted, lost in thought. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, the horizon offering no promise of land. The solitude was almost welcome. After all he had seen, after all he had learned, he did not know if he could bear to be among men again. But the sea, as always, had its own plans. Captured by humans once more after several days alone at sea, Gulliver spotted a ship in the distance. At first, he was hopeful. Perhaps he would be rescued, taken to civilization where he could rest and recover. But as the ship drew closer, his hope turned to dread. It was a Portuguese vessel, and as it approached, he realized with horror that he would soon be among men again, his own kind, the very beings he now despised. He considered fleeing, turning his boat away, but it was no use. The ship's crew had already seen him, and before he could react, they had pulled him aboard. The sailors looked at him with bewilderment. He was ragged, his clothes tattered, his hair unkempt. His appearance was wild, his eyes filled with a strange intensity. They spoke to him in Portuguese, but he barely registered their words. The mere sight of them, these human beings, these Yahoos, disgusted him. The ship's captain, a kind but firm man named Pedro de Mendes, approached him. "Who are you?" he asked in English. "Where have you come from?" Gulliver hesitated. How could he explain? Would they even believe him if he told the truth? He looked at the captain and saw nothing but the traits of a Yahoo: greed, ignorance, arrogance. It made him sick. Yet, despite his disgust, Captain Mendes treated him with kindness. He gave him fresh clothes, food, and a place to rest. The crew, though wary of the strange, wild-looking Englishman, did not mistreat him. They were patient with his odd behavior, his reluctance to speak, his refusal to eat the same food they did. But no matter how well they treated him, Gulliver could not bear their presence. To him, they were filthy, irrational creatures, inferior in every way to the Houyhnhnms. He recoiled from their touch, refused to engage in their conversations, and spent most of his time alone, staring out at the sea, longing for the land he had been forced to leave. Captain Mendez watched him with concern. "You have suffered much," he said one evening as he sat beside Gulliver on the deck. "I do not know where you have been, but it has changed you." Gulliver said nothing. The captain continued, "Whatever you have seen, whatever you have learned, you must remember this: you are a man, and men must live among men." But Gulliver did not want to live among men. He loathed them. He despised their greed, their cruelty, their lies. Compared to the Houyhnhnms, they were nothing but brutes. Yet, despite his resistance, the ship carried him ever closer to England, to the world he had once called home. Returned to England, a man forever changed after weeks at sea, the ship reached England. Captain Mendez, ever kind, offered Gulliver money and assistance, but Gulliver refused. He could not stand to be in the presence of a Yahoo, even one as generous as the captain. He made his way back to his home, but every step felt wrong. The streets of London, once so familiar, now seemed alien. The people, his own kind, disgusted him. He recoiled at their laughter, their conversations, their touch. At last, he reached his house. Mary, his wife, was there, just as she had been when he left. She gasped when she saw him, her eyes wide with shock. "Lemuel," she whispered. But Gulliver could not bring himself to embrace her. The mere sight of her repulsed him. She was a Yahoo. His children, too, ran to him, but he could not hold them. He withdrew from them, shrinking away as though they carried some vile disease. Mary wept. "What has happened to you?" she cried. "You are not the man I married." She was right. He was not. The Gulliver who had left England was gone, replaced by a man who no longer belonged in this world. For years, he lived in self-imposed isolation. He could not bear the company of other humans. He ate his meals alone, spoke to no one, unless absolutely necessary. The only creatures he could tolerate were horses. They reminded him of the Houyhnhnms, the noble, rational beings he had come to revere. He spent hours in the stables, speaking to them, preferring their presence over that of his own family. His wife pleaded with him to return to normal, to be a husband and father once more. But he could not. To live as a man among men was unbearable. He had traveled across the world, seen lands beyond imagination. He had witnessed both the pettiness of the Lilliputians and the wisdom of the Brobdingnagians. He had encountered floating islands, talking horses, and beasts that mirrored mankind's worst nature. And now he had returned home, but he no longer belonged. As he sat alone in his study, surrounded by the silence of his self-imposed exile, he knew the truth. He had spent his life seeking knowledge, chasing adventure, hoping to find meaning beyond the shores of England. And in the end, he had found it. But it had cost him everything. Years passed, but time did nothing to lessen Gulliver's disdain for humanity. His wife, Mary, remained patient, waiting for the man she had once loved to return to her. But Gulliver kept his distance. The very idea of human touch repulsed him. He refused to eat with his family, refused to engage in their conversations, refused to live as a husband or father. Instead, he withdrew further into his own world, a world in which only one truth existed. He had once known perfection, and he had been cast out of it. His only solace lay in the company of horses. In the stables behind his home, he found creatures that, though incapable of speech, reminded him of the Houyhnhnms. He spent hours tending to them, talking to them, imagining that they understood him. Their presence gave him the illusion of being among rational beings again, and so he clung to them as though they were the last remnants of his lost paradise. Mary pleaded with him to return to normal life, but her words fell on deaf ears. To Gulliver, she was no different from the yahoos he had left behind. In his mind, she represented the chaos, greed, and ignorance he had come to despise. No matter how much she tried to remind him of the life they had once shared, it was useless. The man she had married no longer existed. A mind broken by knowledge, though Gulliver had physically returned to England, his mind remained elsewhere. He spent his days in solitude, reading, thinking, and reliving his travels. He could not forget the wisdom of the Brobdingnagians, the illusions of the Laputians, the absurdities of the Lilliputians, and most of all, the perfection of the Houyhnhnms. He had seen the worst and best of the world, and now he was left to exist in a place that disgusted him. His disillusionment with humanity grew deeper. Every interaction with other people seemed to confirm his belief that they were no better than the yahoos. He saw greed in merchants, arrogance in politicians, and ignorance in scholars. He no longer considered himself one of them. In his heart, he was an exile, a man who had glimpsed something greater but was doomed to live among beasts. His writings became his only form of expression. He documented his journeys in painful detail, pouring out his bitterness and disappointment onto the pages. He wrote not to entertain, but to reveal the truth, to expose the folly of mankind, to show them what they were, and to remind himself of what he had lost. Yet even as he wrote, he knew that few would understand. The very creatures he sought to enlighten were incapable of true reason. They would read his words and either dismiss them as fantasy or twist them to fit their own narratives. They were incapable of change. A life in isolation as the years went by, Gulliver's alienation became complete. He spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. He refused to sleep in the same bed as his wife, refused to touch her, refused even to look at her for long. If she entered the room, he turned away. He could not bear the sight of her human form, a reminder of the species he had come to despise. His children, too, were strangers to him. He had once hoped that, perhaps, they could be different, that they could be raised with reason, that they could reject the ways of the yahoos. But as they grew older, he saw in them the same instincts, the same foolishness that plagued all mankind. Eventually, even Mary stopped trying. She watched as her husband faded into something unrecognizable, a man who had traveled too far, seen too much, and lost himself in the process. The final reflection by the end of his life, Gulliver had become a man entirely apart from society. Though physically present in England, his heart and soul remained with the Houyhnhnms. He lived among men, but he did not belong to them. And yet, despite his hatred for mankind, there was an irony in his fate. For all his desire to be like the Houyhnhnms, he was still a man. No matter how much he distanced himself, he could never truly escape his nature. The Houyhnhnms had sent him away because he did not belong with them, and the yahoos, the creatures he loathed, were the only ones who could ever accept him. In the end, Gulliver's greatest tragedy was not his travels, nor the suffering he endured, but the knowledge he had gained. He had sought wisdom, but what he found was despair. He had searched for a perfect world, but in doing so, he had lost the ability to live in his own. His journeys had not led him to enlightenment. They had led him to exile. And as he spent his final years in quiet isolation, speaking only to the horses in his stable, he knew one thing for certain: he would never truly belong anywhere again. Final thoughts on Gulliver's Travels. Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels is more than just a fantastical adventure. It is a brutal, satirical critique of humanity. Through Gulliver's experiences, Swift exposes the absurdities of politics, science, and society, using each of Gulliver's destinations to reflect different aspects of human folly. From the petty wars of the Lilliputians to the cold logic of the Houyhnhnms, Swift challenges readers to examine their own world with a critical eye. The novel's final message is one of disillusionment. Gulliver's inability to reintegrate into human society serves as a warning. When one sees the flaws of the world too clearly, it becomes impossible to live within it. Yet, the irony of Gulliver's fate is what makes the novel so powerful. He longs to be rational, like the Houyhnhnms, but his very obsession proves his own irrationality. In the end, he is neither Yahoo nor Houyhnhnm, just a man who has lost his place in the world. Swift's masterpiece remains one of the greatest works of satire ever written, its message as relevant today as it was in the 18th century. It forces us to question our own nature, our own society, and whether true wisdom is a gift or a curse.